You know that feeling when you finally find something you've been searching for? That moment when everything just clicks into place? That's exactly how I felt when I first saw this property. Picture this: a beautiful stretch of land, secluded from the chaos of city life, yet close enough to civilization to not feel completely isolated. It was perfect. Or at least, that's what I thought. It's funny how life has a way of teaching you that perfection often comes with unexpected complications. But we'll get to that part soon enough. First, let me take you back to where it all began, just over a year ago, when I became the proud owner of what I thought would be my own piece of paradise. The real estate agent couldn't stop gushing about how lucky I was to find such a gem. "Properties like this don't come on the market often," she said, beaming as I signed the final papers. And she was right. The house sat on a generous plot of land, bordered by mature trees on one side and what appeared to be a well-maintained community on the other. Now, let me point out something that seemed insignificant at the time, but would later become the center of this entire story. See this narrow strip of land here? Circle appears on screen. It runs right along the edge of my property and connects to one of the streets in the neighboring HOA community. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a clearing in the landscape, maybe an old access point that the previous owners had used for something. Those first few weeks were absolute bliss. I'd wake up early, grab my coffee, and just stand on my porch, taking in the quiet morning air. No traffic noise, no city bustle, just the sound of birds and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I even started planting a garden, marking out spots where I'd plant vegetables come spring. I threw myself into making the place my own. Fresh paint here, new fixtures there, all those little touches that turn a house into a home. The neighbors I did meet seemed friendly enough, offering waves and smiles when our paths crossed. Everything was going exactly as I'd hoped. But you know what they say about things that seem too good to be true? Well, that's where our story takes its first turn. Because what I didn't realize was that my little piece of paradise had a secret that involved that innocent-looking strip of land I mentioned earlier. It started so gradually that I almost didn't notice it at first. A car here, a truck there, using that strip of land as if it were their own personal shortcut. At first, I brushed it off as people making honest mistakes. Maybe they were lost, I thought. Maybe they didn't realize they were on private property. But deep down, I knew something wasn't quite right. There was a pattern forming, and it wasn't the kind that just happens by accident. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a situation that would test my patience, my rights as a property owner, and ultimately my resolve to stand up for what's right. They say hindsight is 20/20, and looking back now, I can see all the warning signs clear as day. But when you're in the middle of it, when strange things start happening bit by bit, it's easy to dismiss them as coincidences. That's exactly what happened here. It started with the tire tracks. One morning, while doing my usual property walk-around, I noticed them. Fresh tracks cutting through my land, following that narrow strip I told you about earlier. At first, I thought maybe someone had made a wrong turn, realized their mistake, and turned around. No big deal, right? But then, it happened again. And again. And again. What started as occasional tire marks turned into a well-worn path. Cars would turn onto my property as if they were following some invisible GPS route, cutting through to reach the HOA community on the other side. Monday, 3 cars. Wednesday, 5 cars. By Friday, I counted 8 different vehicles using my property as their personal shortcut. It was like watching a bizarre parade of entitlement, each driver seemingly more confident than the last that they had every right to be there. I tried being nice about it, I really did, standing outside, waving at the cars as they passed, trying to catch their attention. The responses I got ranged from complete ignorance to looks that seemed to say, "What's your problem?" Some even had the audacity to wave back, as if we were neighbors sharing a friendly greeting rather than them trespassing on my property. One woman actually rolled down her window to tell me, "Everyone uses this road," as if frequency of trespassing somehow made it legal. Another guy just shrugged and kept driving, mud from his tires spraying across my lawn. But the worst were the ones who acted like I was the one causing problems by even questioning their right to cut through my property. Then came the morning that changed everything. I had just returned from an early shift at work, exhausted and looking forward to some peace and quiet. Instead, what I found was a scene that made my blood boil. A car had clearly tried to turn too sharply onto the makeshift road, leaving deep ruts in my lawn where their tires had spun out in the wet grass. This wasn't just about convenience anymore. This wasn't about putting up with a minor annoyance. This was actual damage to my property, and it was the last straw. Standing there looking at the torn-up grass and mud tracks, I knew something had to change. That's when I made my first attempt to handle things the proper way. I called the HOA, thinking surely they'd want to address this situation. After all, it was their residents using my land as a shortcut. The conversation that followed was both enlightening and infuriating. "I'm sorry, but since the strip of land isn't within our jurisdiction, there's nothing we can do about it," the HOA representative told me, their voice carrying that special tone of bureaucratic indifference that seems to say, "Not my problem." That's when I realized if I wanted this situation resolved, I'd have to take matters into my own hands. No more Mr. Nice Guy. No more friendly waves or polite requests. It was time to protect what was rightfully mine. Little did I know, my decision to stand up for my property rights was about to unleash a storm of drama that would make a reality TV show look tame in comparison. But sometimes, you have to draw a line in the sand, or in my case, across a makeshift road, and say enough is enough. The morning that changed everything started like any other. I was getting ready for work, sipping my coffee, and planning my day when I heard the unmistakable sound of tires spinning against wet earth. Living in a quiet area, any unusual noise tends to grab your attention, and this one had me heading straight for my window. What I saw made my stomach turn. A large black SUV was stuck in my yard, right where that unofficial shortcut crossed my property. The driver was repeatedly gunning the engine, causing the tires to dig deeper and deeper into my lawn. With each rev of the engine, chunks of grass and mud flew through the air, creating what would soon become a devastating mess on my property. I rushed outside, waving my arms to get the driver's attention, but they were too focused on their predicament to notice me. By the time I reached the area, the damage was done. The SUV had finally gained traction and sped away, leaving behind deep tire tracks that had torn through my carefully maintained lawn. What was once a smooth, green expanse now looked like a monster truck rally had taken place. The destruction was extensive. Deep ruts, some nearly a foot deep, scarred my property. The grass was completely torn away in places, exposing the dark soil beneath. Mud had been sprayed in all directions, coating nearby plants and even spattering the side of my house. This wasn't just an inconvenience anymore. This was significant property damage. I immediately grabbed my phone and started documenting everything. Photos of the tire tracks, the mud spray, the torn-up grass, everything that showed the extent of the destruction. Then I did what any reasonable person would do. I called the HOA again. This was their resident, after all, and surely they couldn't ignore actual property damage. The conversation that followed was both frustrating and enlightening. The HOA representative listened to my complaint with that particular kind of bureaucratic indifference that makes your blood boil. "While we understand your concern," they said, "since this occurred on private property outside our jurisdiction, there's nothing we can do about it. Have you considered installing barriers?" That was when something inside me snapped. Not in an angry way, but in that moment of crystal clarity when you realize exactly what needs to be done. I'd tried being nice. I'd tried going through proper channels. I'd tried everything except taking firm action to protect what was mine. The HOA's suggestion of barriers, though dismissively given, was actually the solution I needed. I spent the next few hours researching property laws in similar cases. The more I read, the more I realized I wasn't alone in this fight. Countless property owners had faced similar situations with entitled neighbors who thought they had some divine right to use private property as their personal thoroughfare. The good news? The law was clearly on my side. Property rights are fundamental, and no amount of previous usage gives people the right to continue trespassing on private land. Even if they'd been using this shortcut for years, it didn't make it legal or right. I learned about adverse possession, easements, and right-of-way laws. None of them applied here. This was straightforward trespassing, and I had every right to stop it. The damage to my property was the last straw. It was time to take action, and I knew exactly what I needed to do. The plan started forming in my mind: proper fencing, a sturdy gate, security cameras, and clear signage. It would cost money, but as I looked at my torn-up yard, I knew it would be worth every penny. With my research complete and my resolve strengthened, I began implementing my plan to reclaim my property. The first step was finding the right contractor. I wanted someone who understood not just the physical requirements of the job, but the legal implications as well. After several consultations, I found a company that specialized in property security and boundary marking. The plan we developed was comprehensive. First would come a professional survey to ensure every installation was precisely on my property. No one could claim we encroached on public or HOA land. Then would come the fencing, sturdy but attractive, designed to blend with the property's aesthetic while serving its primary purpose of security. The centerpiece would be a heavy-duty gate, positioned exactly at my property line. It would be impossible to bypass without causing obvious damage, and it would be equipped with security features to prevent tampering. Along with the physical barriers, we planned a series of clearly visible no trespassing signs. They would be professionally made and properly positioned, making it impossible for anyone to claim they didn't know they were entering private property. To complete the security system, I invested in high-quality cameras. They would cover every angle of the gate and fence line, recording continuously. If anyone tried to damage or bypass the barriers, I would have clear evidence to take to the authorities. The entire setup was designed to be both a physical and legal deterrent. The installation process took several days. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood, and I could see the looks on people's faces as they drove by. Some seemed angry, others confused, but quite a few appeared understanding. I even had a couple of neighbors come by to express their support, sharing their own stories of dealing with entitled people who didn't respect property boundaries. As the project neared completion, I could feel a sense of anticipation building in the community. The convenient shortcut that so many had taken for granted was about to disappear. I knew there would be pushback. People don't give up perceived privileges easily. But I was prepared. Every installation was documented, every boundary marked, every legal requirement met. Finally, the day arrived when everything was complete. The fence stood strong and secure, the gate firmly locked, and the cameras actively monitoring. Signs clearly marked the property boundaries and stated the no trespassing policy. Looking at it all, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. This was my property, and for the first time since moving in, it truly felt like it. The immediate reactions were exactly what I expected. Cars would approach the gate, stop in surprise, and either turn around in frustration or sit there honking as if that would somehow change the situation. Some people got out of their cars to inspect the gate, probably looking for a way around it. The cameras caught it all, and I watched with a mixture of amusement and vindication. For a few days, things seemed to be settling into a new normal. The traffic stopped. The property damage ended. People began finding alternative routes, and it looked like maybe, just maybe, this would be the end of the story. But as I would soon discover, some people don't accept change easily, especially when it inconveniences them. And one particular HOA board member was about to make that very, very clear. The confrontation I'd been subconsciously waiting for arrived on a quiet Saturday afternoon, just 3 days after completing the fence installation. I was in my home office, catching up on some work, when the sound of an insistent car horn shattered the peaceful afternoon atmosphere. At first, I tried to ignore it, thinking someone would eventually give up and leave. But whoever was out there had other plans, and the honking only grew more aggressive and persistent with each passing minute. After about 5 minutes of this audio assault, I finally stepped outside to investigate. That's when I first met her, the woman who would become the central antagonist in my property rights saga. There she stood next to a pristine white luxury SUV, perfectly manicured hands on her hips, designer sunglasses perched on her nose, radiating an aura of entitlement so strong it was almost visible. She spotted me immediately as I emerged from my house, and her reaction was instantaneous. "Are you the one responsible for this?" she demanded, gesturing dramatically at the gate with perfectly polished nails, her voice carrying that particular tone of authority that comes from years of people bending to your will. The way she said, "this," made it sound like I'd erected some kind of offensive monument rather than a simple security gate. I approached calmly, maintaining my composure despite her hostile demeanor. "Yes, I am," I replied evenly. "This is private property." I had rehearsed this conversation in my head numerous times, knowing it was inevitable, but nothing had quite prepared me for the reality of dealing with someone so completely convinced of their own authority. "You need to open this gate immediately," she announced, as if issuing a royal decree. "I'm already late for my appointment, and this is the way I always go. We've been using this road for years." The emphasis she placed on "we" made it clear she considered herself the voice of the entire neighborhood, appointed by some invisible authority to defend their perceived rights. That's when she dropped what she clearly thought was her trump card. "I'm on the HOA board," she declared, straightening her posture even more, if that was possible. Her tone suggested these words should carry the weight of divine authority. "We've never had any problems with this access point until you came along." I took a deep breath, reminding myself to stay professional. "I understand you've been using this path," I began, choosing my words carefully. "But it's not a public road. It's private property, my property, and I have every right to restrict access to it." Her face contorted with indignation, cheeks flushing red beneath her expensive makeup. "Do you have any idea who I am?" she demanded, voice rising to a pitch that probably had dogs cowering in nearby yards. "I've lived in this community for 15 years. I'm not just on the board. I'm the vice president of the HOA. You can't just come in here and change things that have been working fine for years." The way she emphasized her position made it clear she wasn't used to being challenged. In her world, HOA vice president probably carried the same weight as Supreme Court justice. I remained unmoved. "Actually, I can," I stated firmly. "This is my property, not HOA property. The fact that people have been trespassing doesn't make it right or legal." She actually gasped at that as if I'd said something scandalous. "Trespassing? How dare you? This is a community access point." Her voice had taken on a shrill quality that made me want to step back, but I held my ground. I noticed other neighbors had started to peek out of their houses, drawn by the commotion. A few were even recording on their phones, probably sensing the potential for drama. Karen noticed too, and it seemed to embolden her further. "You clearly don't understand how things work around here," she continued, pulling out her iPhone with flourish. "I'm going to make sure you learn. This is not how we do things in our community." The way she emphasized "our" made it clear she didn't consider me part of that community. As she began dialing, she shot me what she probably thought was an intimidating look. "You're going to regret this," she declared. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. By the time I'm done, you'll wish you'd never moved here." I remained silent, watching as she positioned herself for what would clearly be a performance worthy of Broadway. In that moment, I realized this confrontation was about much more than a simple gate or a convenient shortcut. This was about power, about control, and about someone whose sense of authority had just collided head-on with the immovable object of property law. What happened next was both surreal and predictable. Karen, still clutching her iPhone like a weapon, dialed 911. Yes, you read that right. She actually called emergency services because she couldn't use my private property as her personal shortcut. As she dialed, she kept shooting me triumphant looks, clearly convinced that law enforcement would arrive and immediately take her side. "Yes, hello? This is an emergency," she began, her voice taking on that particular tone people use when they're trying to sound official while making a completely ridiculous complaint. "I need to report a situation at address. Someone has blocked access to our neighborhood road with an illegal gate. Yes, they're refusing to open it. I'm the vice president of the HOA board, and this is causing a serious safety issue for our community." I couldn't help but notice how she conveniently left out the fact that this was private property, not a neighborhood road. I pulled out my own phone and started recording, knowing documentation would be crucial. As she continued her conversation with the dispatcher, each sentence became more elaborate than the last. "The property owner is here right now, being completely uncooperative," she continued, casting me a glare that would have withered a lesser person. "This is a major safety issue. What if emergency vehicles need to get through? He's putting our entire community at risk." The irony of her sudden concern for emergency vehicle access, when moments ago she was worried about being late to an appointment, wasn't lost on me. While we waited for the police to arrive, Karen busied herself making additional phone calls, presumably to other HOA board members. I could hear snippets of her conversations. "You won't believe what's happening," and "We need to call an emergency board meeting," and my personal favorite, "He thinks he can just do whatever he wants with his property." It took about 15 minutes for 2 police cruisers to arrive. During that time, Karen had worked herself into quite a state, pacing back and forth, occasionally shooting me dirty looks, and muttering under her breath about property values and community standards. I used the time productively, gathering my property documentation, survey maps, and permits, all neatly organized in a folder I kept handy for exactly this type of situation. The first officer approached us, looking professional but slightly bemused. "We received a report about a blocked road," he began, glancing between Karen and me, likely trying to assess the situation. Before Karen could launch into what I'm sure would have been an Oscar-worthy performance, I spoke up calmly. "Officer, I'm the property owner," I began, holding up my documentation. "What's being called a blocked road is actually my private property. I recently installed this gate to prevent trespassing after having issues with people using my land as a shortcut. I have all the documentation right here." Karen immediately interjected, her voice rising with indignation. "We've been using this road for years," she practically shouted. "He can't just block it off. I'm the vice president of the HOA board, and this is a crucial access point for our community. We have jurisdiction here." The officer maintained his professional demeanor, though I caught a slight raise of his eyebrow at Karen's outburst. "Ma'am, please let me review the documentation first." He turned to me, accepting the property maps and permits I offered. As the first officer reviewed the documents, his partner began taking notes about the situation. Karen continued her protestations, each one becoming more elaborate than the last. "This is discrimination against our community," she declared at one point, causing both officers to exchange a knowing glance. After reviewing everything, the first officer turned to Karen. "Ma'am, I need to explain something to you," he began patiently. "This is private property. The owner has every right to restrict access to it. If this has been used as a shortcut in the past, that was actually trespassing, even if no one objected to it at the time." Karen's face went through several shades of red. But we're the HOA. We have jurisdiction over this area," she sputtered, seemingly unable to comprehend that her HOA authority had finally met its match. The officer shook his head. "No, ma'am, you don't. The HOA's jurisdiction ends at its property boundaries. This land belongs to this gentleman, and he has the right to secure it as he sees fit." A week after the police incident, it arrived. A formal letter from the HOA, printed on official letterhead with the community logo prominently displayed at the top. I'd been expecting something like this, but the actual contents of the letter still managed to surprise me. The HOA wasn't just complaining, they were mobilizing for war. The letter began with the usual formal pleasantries before diving into what they called serious concerns about recent modifications to community access points. I couldn't help but notice how they carefully avoided calling it my private property, instead using phrases like traditionally accessible areas and community-utilized pathways. The meat of the letter was a demand for my attendance at an emergency HOA board meeting scheduled for the following week. They made it clear this wasn't a request. The tone suggested that failing to appear would be seen as a hostile action. The letter detailed a list of community grievances that would be addressed, including unauthorized blockage of established access routes and disruption of community transit patterns. What really caught my attention was the not-so-subtle threat woven throughout the document. Phrases like potential legal remedies and community covenant enforcement were sprinkled liberally throughout the text. They were trying to intimidate me with legal jargon, hoping I'd back down rather than face their collective wrath. I spent the next few days preparing for the meeting. This wasn't going to be a friendly discussion. It was going to be an inquisition, and I needed to be ready. I gathered every piece of documentation I could find: property surveys, deed records, local ordinances about private property rights, and photographs of the damage that had been done to my property before I installed the gate. I also did some deeper research into HOA law and private property rights. The more I read, the more confident I became in my position. Yes, HOAs have significant power within their boundaries, but that power stops cold at their property lines. They can't simply claim rights over private property because it's convenient for their members. The day before the meeting, I received another surprise: a series of emails from other community members. Not everyone, it seemed, was on Karen's side. Several residents wrote to express their support, sharing their own stories of dealing with HOA overreach. One particularly detailed email came from a retired lawyer who lived in the community, offering some valuable insights into dealing with aggressive HOAs. As I organized my documentation that evening, I realized this meeting would be about more than just my gate. It would be about standing up to the kind of institutional bullying that HOAs often engage in, thinking their authority extends far beyond its legal boundaries. I was ready to make my case, not just for myself, but for everyone who'd ever felt powerless against an overzealous HOA board. I also received a heads up from a sympathetic neighbor that Karen had been rallying support all week, going door to door to gather signatures for some kind of petition. She'd apparently been telling everyone that my gate was just the beginning, that if I wasn't stopped, property values would plummet, and the community's way of life would be forever destroyed. The night before the meeting, I reviewed everything one final time. My documentation was organized, my arguments were prepared, and I was ready for whatever they might throw at me. I knew this wouldn't be the end of it. People like Karen don't give up easily, but I was determined to stand my ground. The HOA meeting room was packed when I arrived. It seemed like half the neighborhood had turned out for what promised to be quite a show. The board members sat at a long table at the front of the room, with Karen positioned prominently near the center, already wearing an expression of righteous indignation. I took my seat in the front row, placing my folder of documentation on my lap. The room buzzed with whispered conversations, and I could feel dozens of eyes watching me. Some gazes were hostile, others curious, and a few, more than I expected, seemed supportive. The board president, a serious-looking man in his 60s, called the meeting to order. He began with a recap of the situation, carefully worded to make it sound like I was the aggressor who had unilaterally decided to disrupt community life. Karen sat next to him, nodding emphatically at every point. "We're here today," the president announced, "to address serious concerns about recent actions that have disrupted our community's long-established patterns of access and movement." He paused for effect before continuing. "For years, our residents have relied on certain pathways to navigate our neighborhood efficiently. The recent blockage of one such access point has caused significant distress and inconvenience to many of our residents." That's when Karen jumped in, apparently unable to contain herself any longer. "This is about more than just convenience," she declared, her voice carrying that same authoritative tone from our previous encounter. "This is about community safety and property values. What happens when emergency vehicles need quick access? What about when potential buyers see our community divided by gates and fences?" Several heads in the audience nodded in agreement. Karen had clearly done her work well, rallying support for her position, but I also noticed several residents rolling their eyes or shaking their heads slightly at her dramatic presentation. When it was my turn to speak, I stood calmly and addressed the room. "Thank you for allowing me to address these concerns," I began, maintaining a professional tone. "I understand change can be difficult, but there are several important points that need to be clarified." I opened my folder and began presenting my case methodically. First, the area in question is private property, my property. It's not HOA land, it's not a public road, and it's not a community access point. It's my private property that people have been using without permission. I displayed the property survey pointing out the clear boundaries. Second, the damage being done to my property was significant. I showed the photographs of the torn-up lawn and tire tracks. I tried addressing this through proper channels first, but was told by the HOA that since it wasn't their property, they couldn't help. The room grew quiet as I continued. As for emergency vehicle access, I've already provided the local emergency services with documentation showing the proper access routes to all properties. Not once in the history of this area has that strip of land been designated as an emergency access route. I could see some board members shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The facts were clear and they knew it, but Karen wasn't about to let facts get in the way of her crusade. She interrupted repeatedly, each time with a new objection or complaint, each one more dramatic than the last. The meeting continued for over 2 hours, with residents taking turns expressing their views. While some supported Karen's position, others spoke up in my favor, recognizing the simple truth that private property rights needed to be respected. The tide was beginning to turn, and Karen could sense it. The aftermath of the HOA meeting brought a new phase in this ongoing saga. While many residents seemed ready to move on, accepting the reality of the situation, Karen was far from finished. If anything, having her authority publicly challenged seemed to fuel her determination to escalate matters further. 3 days after the meeting, I received a certified letter from a local law firm. The envelope itself looked designed to intimidate, with the firm's name embossed in gold lettering. Inside, I found a carefully worded legal threat that tried to disguise itself as a formal notice of potential legal action. The letter claimed that the HOA was preparing to file a lawsuit based on something called prescriptive easement rights. According to their argument, because residents had been using my property as a throughway for years without previous objection, they had established a legal right to continue doing so. They demanded that I remove the gate and restore access within 72 hours, or face legal action. I'll admit, that letter gave me pause. Not because I thought they had a legitimate case, but because I knew how expensive and time-consuming legal battles can become, even when you're in the right. I immediately contacted my own lawyer, forwarding him the letter and asking for his professional opinion. His response was both reassuring and enlightening. "They're bluffing," he told me during our consultation. "Prescriptive easement claims are notoriously difficult to prove, and in this case, they don't even have the basic elements required. The HOA would have to prove continuous, open, notorious, and adverse use of your property for the statutory period, which in our state is 20 years. He continued to explain that since the property had changed hands multiple times during that period, and there was no documentation of any formal agreement about the use of the land, their case was incredibly weak. Besides, he added, the fact that they tried to handle this through the HOA first, admitting it was private property outside their jurisdiction, undermines any legal claim they might try to make now. Still, Karen wasn't done. When the legal threat failed to intimidate me into immediate compliance, she switched tactics. Suddenly, mysterious posts began appearing on the community Facebook page and Nextdoor.com, suggesting that my gate was causing all sorts of problems. There were claims about delayed emergency responses, completely false, stories about elderly residents having to walk extra distances, greatly exaggerated, and even suggestions that local wildlife was being disrupted by the change in traffic patterns. Absolutely ridiculous. What Karen didn't expect was that her aggressive campaign would actually start working against her. Several residents, tired of the drama and increasingly skeptical of her claims, began speaking up. One resident, a retired emergency responder, publicly debunked the claims about emergency vehicle access. Another shared security camera footage showing that the elderly residents Karen claimed were struggling were actually taking their regular walking routes, completely unaffected by the gate. The situation reached a boiling point when Karen attempted to organize a community protest in front of my house. She created an event page on Facebook, calling for residents to gather with signs and demand the removal of the gate. What she didn't count on was the response from other community members who had grown tired of her crusade. Several residents publicly declined the event, commenting that they supported private property rights and thought the protest was inappropriate. Others began sharing their own stories of dealing with Karen's overreach in other HOA matters. The event page quickly turned into a forum for residents to air their grievances about HOA management in general, and Karen's behavior in particular. The failed protest attempt might have been enough to end things, but I decided it was time to take control of the narrative completely. After weeks of dealing with Karen's escalating tactics, I reached out to a local news station that had a reputation for covering community issues and property rights disputes. To my surprise, they were immediately interested in the story. The producer I spoke with explained that they'd been covering a series of stories about HOA overreach in various communities, and my situation fit perfectly into their ongoing investigation. They wanted to do a full segment, complete with interviews, documentation review, and even drone footage of the property in question. The day of filming, I was ready. I had all my documentation organized, including a timeline of events from the first instance of property damage through to the recent legal threats. I also had security camera footage showing the previous problems with traffic cutting through my property, and clear documentation of all the proper legal steps I'd taken to secure my land. The news crew arrived early in the morning, setting up multiple cameras to capture different angles. The reporter, a veteran journalist who specialized in community issues, immediately grasped the significance of the story. "This isn't just about a gate," she said during our pre-interview discussion. "This is about property rights, community dynamics, and the limits of HOA authority." During the interview, I made sure to remain factual and professional. I explained how I had attempted to address the issue through proper channels first, how I had documented everything, and how I had followed all legal requirements in securing my property. I also emphasized that this wasn't about being unfriendly or uncooperative. It was simply about protecting my property rights and preventing damage to my land. The crew filmed the gate, the property boundaries, and the alternative routes that residents could use. They interviewed several neighbors, including both supporters and opponents of my position. What emerged was a clear picture of how one HOA board member's personal vendetta had turned a simple property rights issue into a community-wide drama. Karen, predictably, couldn't resist trying to control the narrative. When she saw the news crew, she came rushing out to give her side of the story. The resulting interview was probably not what she had hoped for. The reporter asked direct, factual questions about the HOA's legal authority over private property, about the failed legal threats, and about the attempted protest. Karen's responses, filled with emotional appeals and vague references to community standards, stood in stark contrast to the documented facts and legal realities I had presented. The story aired during the evening news a week later. The segment was titled, "Property Rights vs. HOA Authority, When Community Power Goes Too Far." It presented a balanced but clear picture of the situation, including interviews with legal experts who confirmed that the HOA had no authority over my property and that their legal threats were baseless. The public response was overwhelming. The story got picked up by several online news outlets and began circulating on social media. Comments and messages poured in from people who had dealt with similar situations, thanking me for standing up to HOA overreach. Local property rights groups reached out, offering support and resources. But the most significant impact was in my own community. The public exposure of the situation, combined with the clear legal analysis presented in the news segment, finally broke Karen's influence over the issue. Residents who had been quietly skeptical of her actions now felt empowered to speak up. The HOA board, facing public scrutiny, began to distance themselves from her aggressive tactics. The aftermath of the news story brought changes I never expected. The morning after the segment aired, I was working from home when I heard a gentle knock at my door. Not the aggressive pounding or insistent doorbell ringing I'd grown accustomed to, just a polite, almost hesitant knock. When I opened the door, I found Karen standing there, but not the Karen I'd come to know over the past months. Gone was the imperious stance, the designer sunglasses, and the air of untouchable authority. Instead, she looked human, vulnerable even. She wasn't wearing her usual power suit, just casual clothes, and her expression was something I'd never seen before: humility. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice lacking its usual commanding tone. "I've been doing a lot of thinking and, well, I owe you an apology." Of all the scenarios I'd imagined for how this situation might resolve, this hadn't even made the list. I invited her in, more out of curiosity than anything else. We sat in my living room, and for a moment there was awkward silence. Then Karen began to speak, and what followed was one of the most genuine moments of self-reflection I'd ever witnessed. Seeing myself on that news segment was a wake-up call, she admitted, staring down at her hands. I looked terrible. Not just my actions, but the way I came across. I've been on the HOA board for so long, I guess I forgot that authority has limits, that being right isn't the same as having rights. She went on to explain how the news coverage had affected her personally. Her phone had been buzzing nonstop with calls and messages from friends and family who'd seen the story. Her own daughter had called from college, embarrassed by her mother's behavior. "Mom," she'd said, "you're becoming one of those HOA Karen memes everyone jokes about." That hit hard, Karen continued. I've always prided myself on being a community leader, someone who helps maintain standards and property values. But somewhere along the way I crossed a line. I became so focused on maintaining control that I lost sight of what's right and fair. She explained how the previous night, unable to sleep, she'd gone through all her emails and social media posts about the gate situation. Reading them with fresh eyes, she was shocked by her own behavior. The threats, the exaggerations, the attempts to rally the community against me. It all seemed so petty and unnecessary now. "I didn't just wrong you," she admitted. "I divided the community. I made up problems that didn't exist. I tried to use my position on the board to bully you into giving up your legal rights. And for what? To save a few minutes on my daily commute?" What struck me most was how genuine she seemed. This wasn't the carefully crafted public apology of someone trying to save face. This was someone who had genuinely realized the error of their ways and was truly remorseful. "The thing is," she continued, "when I first joined the HOA board, it was because I wanted to help the community. I wanted to maintain the beautiful neighborhood we all chose to live in, but somewhere along the way, that desire to help turned into a need to control. Your gate became a symbol of something challenging my authority, and I just couldn't let it go." She then revealed something I hadn't known. The HOA board had asked her to step down from her position as vice president. They felt her handling of the situation had exposed them to potential legal liability and had damaged the community's reputation. She had agreed to resign. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," she said. "What I did was wrong, and I have to live with that. But I wanted you to know that I understand now. Your property is your property. You have every right to protect it, and I'm sorry for trying to take that right away from you." By the end of our conversation, I felt like I was seeing the real person behind the Karen persona for the first time. She wasn't a monster. She was just someone who had lost perspective and let power go to her head. Her apology wouldn't erase what had happened, but it was a significant step toward healing the community divide she had created. In the weeks that followed Karen's apology, life in the neighborhood began to return to normal, though normal had taken on a new meaning. The HOA sent out an official letter to all residents, acknowledging that they had overstepped their bounds and clarifying the limits of their authority. They included a detailed map showing HOA boundaries and emphasizing respect for private property rights. The letter also announced several changes to HOA policies, directly resulting from the controversy. They established new guidelines for handling disputes, emphasizing mediation and legal consultation before taking any action. They also created a resident advisory committee to provide oversight of board decisions, ensuring that no single board member could pursue personal vendettas using HOA resources. Karen kept her word about stepping down, and her replacement on the board was someone who had actually supported my position throughout the controversy, a retired real estate lawyer who understood property rights and the importance of maintaining proper boundaries, both literal and figurative. The community itself seemed to have learned valuable lessons from the experience. Neighbors who had previously been intimidated by the HOA began speaking up at meetings, questioning policies they felt were unfair or overreaching. The atmosphere of fear and blind compliance that had dominated HOA meetings was replaced by healthy discussion and debate. As for the traffic issue that started it all, people adjusted surprisingly quickly to using the proper roads. Some residents even admitted that the previous shortcut through my property had been dangerous, particularly for children playing in the area. The HOA worked with the city to improve signage and traffic flow on the main roads, making the proper routes more efficient. My relationship with the neighborhood improved as well. Those who had supported me during the controversy became friends, and even some who had initially opposed me came around to admit I had been right to stand my ground. The property damage stopped completely, and my yard finally had a chance to recover from the years of abuse. Karen, true to her word about wanting to make amends, became an unexpected ally. She used her experience as a cautionary tale at the next regional HOA conference, giving a presentation about the importance of respecting property rights and the dangers of overreach. Her story resonated with other HOA boards, leading several to review and revise their own policies. The local news station did a follow-up story 6 months later, focusing on how the community had transformed after the controversy. They interviewed residents who spoke about the positive changes in HOA management and the improved sense of community. The story even got picked up by several property rights organizations, who used it as a case study in how to effectively stand up to HOA overreach. Looking back on the whole experience, I realized it had taught all of us valuable lessons. For me, it reinforced the importance of standing up for your rights even when faced with intimidation and pressure. For the HOA, it was a lesson in the limits of their authority and the importance of fair and transparent governance. For the community, it demonstrated that positive change is possible when people are willing to stand up for what's right. The gate still stands at the edge of my property, but it's no longer a symbol of division. Instead, it's a reminder that boundaries, when properly established and respected, can actually bring a community together. The HOA continues to function, but with a new emphasis on serving the community rather than controlling it. As I sit on my porch now, enjoying the peace and quiet of my property, I sometimes think about how different things could have been if I'd given in to the pressure, if I'd let intimidation overcome my rights. The experience taught me that sometimes the hardest battles are the ones most worth fighting, not just for yourself, but for the principle of the thing. These days, when I see new residents moving into the neighborhood, I make a point of welcoming them and sharing our community's story, not to stir up old controversies, but to help them understand that they're joining a neighborhood that learned the hard way about the importance of respecting both individual rights and community needs. And as for that patch of land that started it all, it's now a thriving garden, complete with flowers and native plants. What was once a source of conflict has become a symbol of renewal and growth, a daily reminder that even the most difficult situations can lead to positive change if we're willing to stand up for what's right and remain open to learning from our experiences.